studying Edexcel IGCSE English Language and desperate to get higher marks for question 5, in particular when comparing 127 hours between a rock and a hard place with an unseen text. Well, new material on the way. A new AQA classic, Touching the Void, is going to be used to compare to 127 hours. Let me give you tips on technique and show you an outstanding response for question 5. Stay tuned. Yes, Schofield on Shakespeare.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
So this question is out of 22. At the top end, what are we looking for? Varied and comprehensive range of comparisons covering both texts as a whole. You also need some brief analysis of each quotation using subject terminology. Make sure that your response is balanced. You must have a reasonably equal split between the two texts. I think an introduction is important for question 5, whereas there probably isn't time for one in question 4. Sum up the two texts in relation to the question within this introduction and include an initial similarity difference. You should have 4 chunky paragraphs after your introduction. Start each paragraph with a comparative statement, such as, both texts suggest this. This can be reasonably simple, but you should then dissect this similarity by pointing out a way in which the similarity is treated differently within the two texts. Always ensure that you use quotations, short ones, to back up your points, and you need to analyse them briefly. You should also develop or extend your initial similarity mid-paragraph, and once again, back up your points with analysed quotations from both texts. This video is going to explore this question. Compare how the writers present their ideas and perspectives about their experiences. Time for you to have a read through the text if you've not already done this. They will appear at 5-second intervals. Press pause now.
Remember the principle. Start each main paragraph, of which there's 4, with a comparative statement beginning with both. Then, in the second sentence, explain how this similarity is presented differently in the two texts.
Typically, it will look something like this. Why not look back at the text now and try to jot down 4 of these, which could potentially be used to kick off your 4 main paragraphs. Go on, give it a go. Press pause now. Fancy a gander at my topic sentences? You're in luck. They're about to appear on screen at 5-second intervals. You've got this. Press pause now. Time now for you to have a go. Write a full question 5, remembering to use topic sentences at the beginning of each main paragraph, in which you first state a similarity and then explain how the similarity is presented differently within each text. Back up your points with quotations from each text and develop your initial point mid-paragraph, with this development once again being backed up by quotations from each text. You also need to include an introduction in which you summarise each text in relation to the question and introduce an initial comparative point. What are you waiting for? Write that fabulous essay. Aim for 22 out of 22. The text will reappear now at 3-second intervals. Press pause now.
How did you get on? Produce a 22 out of 22 cracker. Time to compare your response with mine.
Text 1 features 2 climbers descending a Peruvian mountain. Unfortunately, one of them has sustained a broken leg and thus needs to be lowered down. Text 2 is also about a mountainous descent. However, this climber is rather foolishly on his own and thus is left in a perilous situation when a chockstone crushes and traps his right arm. There are numerous other differences between the two texts, including the fact that the weather conditions are much colder in text 1 and the terrain is more challenging in text 2. Both texts present men who feel nervous about significant injuries. However, in text 1, Joe is in excruciating pain due to his broken leg, whereas in text 2, Ralston is in shock at the realisation his right arm has become stuck beneath a chockstone. In text 1, Joe's pain is revealed as he is lowered down the mountain by his partner. A wave of nausea and pain swept over me. The imagery suggests that Joe feels overwhelmed by the pain of his broken leg. It is continually being knocked against the icy rock face as he is being lowered, leaving him feeling physically sick and helpless. In contrast, in text 2, the arm gets stuck towards the end of the text, whereas in text 1, it has occurred prior to the beginning. Ralston writes, "Anxiety has my brain tweaking. Searing hot pain shoots from my wrist up my arm." Clearly, Ralston, like Joe, feels significant pain, hence the hyphenated adjective searing hot. However, unlike Joe, he cannot afford to be a merely passive vessel, hence the importance of his brain jerking into life to come up with a plan to save his life. That said, Joe's pain does appear to be worse than Ralston's. As well as feeling physically sick, he reveals that parts within the joint seem to shear past each other with a sickening, grisly crunch. The ghastly onomatopoeia implies that the bones within the leg are knocking against each other in a horribly unprotected, unhealthy way. In contrast, although Ralston has had skin torn off, he does appear able to use the rest of his body competently in his efforts to free his arm from the chockstone. Hence, he is able to shove against the large boulder, heaving, pushing. These verbs suggest a man who may be able to put aside his appalling pain for at least some moments, whilst he tries to get himself out of a life-threatening situation. Both texts present men who feel apprehensive as they try to descend from a remote, challenging peak. However, in text 1, Joe is able to rely on the no-nonsense assistance from a fellow climber, whereas in text 2, Ralston is completely on his own and has to weigh up all of his decisions without any help. Joe's fellow climber, Simon, is clearly committed to bringing his partner safely down from the Peruvian peak. Even better, he appears competent, as implied by the speed and readiness of his actions. he had seated himself in the hole and had the ropes ready for another lowering. This compound sentence reassures with its simplicity and lack of hesitation. Simon appears a man who knows how to use safety equipment and follow appropriate procedures. In a different way in text 2, Ralston has to think very carefully for himself throughout the descent, including prior to having his arm trapped. By another drop-off, he weighs up distances and risks. This one is maybe 11 or 12 feet high, of a different geometry. Although the weather appears to be warmer, Ralston's descent seems far less straightforward than Simon's, whereas the latter can descend quickly and predict a positive finish time. At this rate, we should be down by 9 o'clock. Ralston consistently stops to assess risk. This includes the idea of standing on a chalk stone. He writes, "If I can step onto it, then I'll have a 9-foot height to descend." The conditional sentence implicitly reveals that Ralston knows that the rock might not take his weight, potentially resulting in catastrophic consequences, even death. Both texts present men who recognise the importance of maintaining a positive mindset faced with challenging, life-threatening conditions. However, in text 1, Joe is buoyed by his partner's positivity, whereas in text 2, Ralston needs to imagine cliched movie-style rescues in order to provide some impetus. Throbbing with pain and angst, Joe recognises the pointlessness of complaining and instead appears inspired by Simon's body language. He writes, his confidence was infectious. The adjective infectious suggests that in spite of his appalling pain, Joe trusts and likes his climbing partner so much that he finds himself being carried along by his optimism. In contrast, in text 2, Ralston is dangerously isolated. Rather than a friend to help lift him up, he conjures up a probably apocryphal story in which an adrenaline-stoked mum lifts an overturned car. This imagery sounds inspired by a dire made-for-TV feel-good American movie. However, crucially, it does inject Ralston with some energy as he tries to lift the boulder away from his trapped right arm. Nonetheless, in both texts, the optimism is short-lived. In text 1, Joe rapidly forgets Simon's grinning face as they continue their descent down the mountain, resulting in hammering torture for his broken leg. Clearly, the throbs of pain make positivity virtually impossible. Similarly, the end of text 2 shows that even thoughts of a mum against all odds rescue haven't resulted in Ralston being able to free his arm. Nothing. The one-word dramatic short sentence tantalisingly leaves the foolish lone climber trapped with no prospect of rescue, at least within this extract. Finally, both texts present men who operate within exceptionally demanding climates and conditions. However, in text 1, the weather appears to be colder and much more dangerous than in text 2. For instance, the opening to the text makes reference to the coal being exposed and windy and an ice cliff. These conditions are extremely dangerous for stranded climbers who could potentially freeze to death if inadequately prepared and not rescued. In contrast, there's no mention of the weather in text 2. Instead, the focus is on the challenging terrain, which requires specialist climbing manoeuvres, including stemming or chimneying, meticulous sliding movements of the body using back, hands and feet. There is also the need for technical expertise in text 1, as seen in Simon's use of a rope to lower Joe down the mountain. However, this doesn't appear technically difficult, and the main difficulty seems to relate to minimising Joe's pain. The tugs came again far too soon, rather than navigating the route down. In contrast, Ralston has clearly found a section of the canyon in which it isn't possible to find a safe route down. Hence the disastrous moment the chalkstone falls and crushes his right hand and ensnares his right arm at the wrist. Overall, Ralston's enterprise seems more foolish than that undertaken by Joe and Simon. Without anyone to help him, and without anyone aware of his plans, the reader is left to wonder how he managed to extricate himself from this life-threatening situation, and whether he had to have any body parts amputated. Some thoughts. Why does this achieve the full Monty? Well, notice the consistent comparisons throughout the paragraph. Both texts. However, in text 1, whereas in text 2. In contrast, in text 2, whereas in text 1, it has occurred prior to the beginning. Like Joe, however, unlike Joe, Joe's pain does appear to be worse than. In contrast, remember to incorporate a minimum of 4 quotations in each main paragraph. Alternate between each one. When introducing quotations, contextualize them. Always explain what's happening succinctly at this point in the text, and thus show the examiner that you most certainly do have a detailed understanding of what is going on. There is a good example of this highlighted on screen now. In many situations, we can find other people's confidence infectious. However, what about if we're stuck up at a mountain in sub-zero temperatures with a broken leg? This makes a difference to our analysis of the writer's presentation of their ideas and perspectives. Rather than a separate conclusion, there isn't time for this. Just add a cheeky overall comma prior to your final point about the second text. This gives the essay an air of finality.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, helping you with question 5 and 127 hours between a rock and a hard place. Thank you very much for watching.